And good Sunday afternoon. I'm Ed Clark, host of The Deal, and thanks for coming in with us on Sunday, June 7th, 2020. As you know, there's been a lot of things going on, obviously, not only with COVID, which we've been talking about almost nonstop for the last 3 months, but in the wake of the murder of George Floyd up in Minneapolis. Over the last week and a half or so, we've seen protests around the nation. And we've had protests here in Raleigh, and I don't want to waste any time because this man is really busy today. He has a meeting with the mayor in just a little bit. Kerwin Pittman, who's been leading a lot of the protests in downtown Raleigh, has some time for us before he has to run back into a meeting with the mayor. Kerwin, welcome to The Deal.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on.
Well, the reason why I wanted you on is because I've been trying to get a hold of some young activists because old farts like me, we've been in the battle a long time. We don't have as much energy as you guys, and you guys have been putting in the work out on the street. And I knew about you before the George Floyd thing. You had been making waves in the community, so I think you're somebody that people need to know. But also people around the country need to know. A lot of times people think that things are only isolated to their area. Kerwin, tell me what's been going on in Raleigh pre-George Floyd, and then talk to me about the protests that you've been able to put together.
Okay, so pre-George Floyd, what's been going on in Raleigh, North Carolina is you've been seeing an influx of police brutality cases involving not only, I can't just break it down to Raleigh Police Department, but all law enforcement. It's something that's been happening in particularly the Black community for a long time, and it's police brutality. So I've been dealing with a lot of cases with that, advocating and being an activist and just letting them know that we're not going to stand for it. And up until this point, it's really been me and a handful of activists, really boots on the ground, putting in work, organizing, strategizing. I did work surrounding the Chiron Hinton incident, and this is the incident in which a young man who was having a mental health crisis was actually beaten by several law enforcement agencies. A dog was let on him. I think a state trooper was fired. Sheriff was fired, and state troopers right now have yet to been even reprimanded, but they're going through the court procedures. I advocated for Sohail Mujarrad. This is a young man who was shot and killed by Raleigh Police Department, but the body camera footage was not turned on the officer, so different circumstances surrounding this case is kind of sketchy. I've advocated for Frederick Hall. This is another man who was having a mental health crisis, and he was fighting with the police. Well, the police really was fighting with him. So I advocated for him. I broke racial stories as far as racist group chat that was recently kind of made national attention. It happened at East Wake High School, in which people in the group chat was talking about killing Black people and different things of that sort. So it's been several, like I could name several boots on the ground cases that I've been in, but I'm just thankful now that it's really a national change in every city. So I'm extremely thankful for that.
Well, Kerwin, you rattle off all those cases, and it makes you wonder, why does it take, the George Floyd case to get people out in this community? One of the things that I've said for a long time is that Raleigh seems to be the more docile folks, and they don't tend to get out and protest and that kind of thing. And again, I think it may be the lack of some young energy in seeing you guys out there and bringing some of these things to the front. Maybe, unfortunately for George Floyd, but but it was a good catalyst to get people to come out. Let's talk about those protests that you've been leading on behalf of Mr. Floyd. One of the ironies is Mr. Floyd was born in North Carolina. And then yesterday, they had services for him down in Rayford, and the pastor of my church gave the prayer at the service, and some of the people in the choir were people from my church community, so down in Harnett County. So there's some connection. You know, you a lot of times with African Americans, you can go anywhere, and there's a connection back to North Carolina. Talk to me about why you felt it was so important to lead protests on behalf of Mr. Floyd here in Raleigh.
It was extremely important because I didn't want us to be that docile city that didn't do nothing, especially when it's injustices happening right here in our backyard, right? So, and my thing is this, and this is what I tell individuals: before we can go out and try to clean up somebody else's backyard in Minneapolis, we got to clean up right here in Raleigh. And so I tell individuals who are out there on the streets, you know, it's unfortunate what happened to George Floyd. But his death, his modern day, people seeing the modern day lynching of this man, it really sparked something in them, and it galvanized the people to really push for change. Mm-hmm. And though I hate it had to happen, since it happened, we cannot waste another life by just letting something go by like this without putting action behind it. So what I tell individuals is, you know, us marching in the streets here in Raleigh, it's not going to change the politics in Minneapolis. I'm going to keep it all the way 100 with you. So when you marching in the streets here in Raleigh, you need to be marching about the politics that's going on right here in your own backyard to stop the brutality of your own people in your own city or in Wake County and surrounding areas. So what me and my team has put together, the Raleigh Demand Justice Coalition. So this is basically just a coalition, so to speak, of different organizations that came together who was already doing the work, boots on the ground before this. And we just came together now and continue to listen to the voices of the people and elevate the voices of the people. So we got 5 demands that we're taking to different individuals, and it seemed like we're getting somewhere. And one of those demands, and at the top of the list, is for the resignation of Raleigh Police Chief Cassandra Deck Brown.
Well, and I wanted to get to that because it says that on your T-shirt.
Yeah.
And so obviously that's an important demand for you, for people who are maybe watching or listening that are in California or Texas, or we even have listeners and viewers in the UK or whatever. Okay. Explain who Deck Brown is and why it's important in your view for her to step down.
Okay, so Cassandra Deck Brown has been the police chief here in Raleigh for 13 years. For 13 years, she has remained silent to the brutality that our officers have inflicted upon the people of the city of Raleigh, the citizens of Raleigh. We've tried to meet with her numerous times to come up with different solutions to enhance community engagement and relationships between Raleigh Police Department and the community that they serve. Every time she slapped our hands down, and really pretty much said she wasn't trying to hear what we had to say. And so as the cases continue to grow and as the brutality continue to grow, the people are fed up, the people are tired. And so if we got a police chief, which is the head of the body of the police department, is not going to step up and speak out against injustice, especially being a Black woman. And that's what kind of hurt me a little more deeper, to remain silent to this and to not reprimand your officers. Even when they're wrong and they do wrong, you still side with them instead of saying, you know, well, we've made mistakes. How can we get better? How can we come to the table and how can we make a difference? Because that's what it's about in leadership. We cannot waste any more time and any more lives to play these political games with these people. The games are over.
Well,
that's why
I want to remind the viewers and listeners you're watching The Deal with Ed Clark. I have a special guest here with us today, Kerwin Pittman. He is an activist here in Raleigh. He's been leading a lot of the protests. We're currently talking about the situation with the police. And one of the things, Kerwin, you bring up is that you have to change stuff in your own community. It's one thing to acknowledge what happened to George Floyd in Minneapolis. And like you said, you can't change things there necessarily. One of the things that's emerged in all of this debate is about how police departments are run. I'm not for sure, and maybe you know this, but how is the police union in Raleigh? Does it have as much sway as the police union in Minneapolis, because in a lot of places, the police union basically runs everything. You can't fire anybody. You can't divulge, video. All those things are because of things that have been negotiated with the police union. What do you know about the police union here in Raleigh, North Carolina?
So in Raleigh, North Carolina, it is a police union, but I don't think they refer to themselves as a police union. So I think this is a non-union state. So they have an organization, but their sway is not as heavy as it would be in other cities who promote police unions, like New York or different places of that nature. So I mean, they because they banding together, so they got a good amount of pull. But at the same token, they're not as strong as far as influential, because this is a non-union state. North Carolina is. So
Right.
So it's kind of like, they really don't have too much.
It might be a little bit easier to get some change. I asked you to come on here, and I pulled you out of a meeting that you're having with the mayor and other local officials here in Raleigh. So again, I appreciate your time. I just got a few more questions, if you don't mind. Talk to me about what you want to talk to the mayor about today. You've been able to get an audience with the mayor, and it's obvious that she knows that she needs to do some talking. What do you guys want to talk about, and what do you have on the table with the mayor's office in Raleigh?
So what we have on the table with the mayor office in Raleigh is, at the top of the list, is these 5 demands. We want Cassandra Deck Brown to step down. We want to defund the police, and what that means by, we don't mean taking money from the police to where they can't do their job, but we mean when you overpay and dump an expeditious amount of money into the police department, this leads to them buying military-style weapons and testing it out on individuals, like they did on the protest on Saturday, by just shooting tear gas canisters to see the effect really into the crowd. So what we mean is, we can pour some of this money back into community engagement. When you overfund the police department and you underfund community engagement things, when you underfund healthcare, when you underfund the schools, what do the people think is going to happen? Like, it's a recipe for disaster. So we have to be equal, and they have to be equitable across the board when you're funding all these different agencies. You can't just overfund one and thinking they're going to be the end all solve all, because obviously that hasn't been working. So we want to defund the police. We don't want no new police stations built in the Black and predominantly African American communities, because that's where they're putting all the police stations in. They're not putting them out there in North Raleigh, where it's affluently Caucasian white communities. We want a cop intervention. So when a good cop intervention, so basically when they see a good cop is with a bad cop, and they see a bad cop doing excessive thing, we want it to be that he must intervene and stop this individual for doing these type of things. We want a oversight board. So we got a community oversight board. We've been pushing for oversight board here in the city of Raleigh, but they created an oversight board because we made so much noise, they had no choice but to listen to the cries of the people. But the oversight board that they put in place is just a fluff board. The only thing the individual will be able to do is review policy, can't make no recommendations, no demands, can't even listen to citizens' complaints, can't even look at officer complaints. It has no power to do nothing. So they just put that in place to say we put it in place, but it's a lot of people who are really dying out here, and we don't have time for these political games. And so these are one of the things we're going to speak about with the mayor. We spoke with the Governor, Roy Cooper, after our protest on last Saturday. The Governor, Roy Cooper, called us in for a meeting, and we talked about strategizing and coming up with plans to de-escalate tension, as well as to how can we build community engagement with local law enforcement on a local level, but as well as a state level, and be a model, not only city, but a model state for the rest of the country. Because I told the governor, I said, the country is watching us. And I said, we have a chance to get it right, and we have a chance to do right. Now, I don't want to be out here protesting against nobody, to be honest with you, but I will if I got to every day, if it's going to make a change. And I'll be out there in the streets every day with as many people as I can get every day if it's going to make a change.
Well, yeah, Kerwin, I hear you. And again, I appreciate your energy and the efforts that you're putting in. Well, we're coming up to the end of our time here. I told you I just going to hold you for 15 minutes. So I'm going to stick to my word because, like I said, you got important business that you're handling today. Just a couple other things real quick in the last minute or so we have. If somebody wants to get in touch with you, do you lead a specific organization, and what are the contact points for that organization?
Okay, so the contact points for my organization is called REPS, Recidivism Reduction Educational Program Services. Our website is www.reps, is RREPS.net. Contact information is up there, as well as social media. You can follow me at Kerwin Pittman. For Facebook, you can follow me at activist underscore Kerwin underscore Pittman. For Instagram, LinkedIn, Kerwin Pittman. Twitter, activist Kerwin Pittman. So if you want to get in touch with me, you can get in touch one of them ways. I'll be more than willing to help and strategize. And hopefully I get input from the community, because I'm uplifting you guys' voice. This is not me pushing my agenda. I'm uplifting the people's voice, and you are the people. If you're listening to this, and we need your help and your support, so you can donate at www.reps.net. If you want to donate to the cause, or please get in contact with me.
Well, Kerwin, you're all over the place, and I do appreciate it. And like I said, I've been following you for a while, been meaning to talk to you. And obviously, these are not the circumstances I wanted to be talking to you under, but I think you're doing important work, and hopefully you'll get something from the mayor today. And like you said, you've met with the governor already, and we're going to continue to push this. I want you to hang on for just a second. I want to remind the folks, Val Atkinson, professor of political science, is going to be in with us next. So just stay right where you are. We're going to take a small break, and we'll come back. I'll come back with Val Atkinson. And then we'll also take your calls later on. You're watching The Deal with Ed Clark.
Republicans may be looking for a different venue. They're looking at Nashville, Tennessee. They may be looking at some other place in North Carolina, but I believe the governor is going to say the same thing, whether it's Charlotte or Jacksonville, it doesn't matter. The point is he can't sanction something today for August, and he knows nothing about what the circumstances are going to look like.
Right. So, yeah, clearly this thing is, we're in a situation where we don't know what the circumstances are going to be. And I'm afraid of people being forced to try to make some sort of a rash decision, and it leads to a much worse outcome. But in the last week or so, we've seen the cases of COVID spike in North Carolina, which would indicate to me that it would not be such a great idea to have anything, mass gatherings, even though these unplanned mass gatherings have been really, really large. Is this really Roy Cooper's decision, though? I mean, ultimately, I think we've seen things open up this week. What do you think is, obviously we don't know, what August is going to look like, but with the numbers looking the way they are, I'm really not clear how people think that this Republican convention could go off in August.
Well, they're looking at it from an economic standpoint, people within North Carolina, Charlotte in particular. They're looking at it from an economic standpoint, Ed, and a lot of Republicans are looking at it from a political standpoint, understanding that they admit that North Carolina is now a purple state, and they don't want to miss out on the opportunity of turning this purple state red for November by holding the convention here, gendering up excitement, and getting their base going in a state that could have a great turnout and take these 15 electoral college votes and put them under the GOP column. That's what they want. And what Roy Cooper is saying, I'm not going to be a witting or unwitting accomplice to this, okay? Right. I have to make decisions for the people, for the safety of people in the state of North Carolina. That's what he's trying to do.
Okay. Yeah, I hear you. Well, let's backtrack a little bit. Like I said, I just kind of wanted to get that out on the table because I know the president's been trying to make a lot of hay out of that. If we go back for a moment, yesterday in Rayford, North Carolina, there was a service for George Floyd, which is is sort of the precursor to all these events, all these protests going on around the country. And come to find out, George Floyd was born in Fayetteville. Come to find out, his relatives are in Cumberland, Harnett, in Hope County. Come to find out that, you know, he has a service at the Cape Fear Conference Center B, which is part of the church community that of my home church where I grew up in, McLean's Chapel Church in Bun Level, North Carolina. The pastor there, Reverend Sutton, actually did the prayer at the service yesterday. So it's indicative of how small a world it is. A lot of times with African American folks, we migrate out of North Carolina, they go to Houston, and then George Floyd ends up in Minneapolis, which I see a lot, because when I travel, I see people all over the place that are from here. That connection back to North Carolina, though, really struck me, because I think the service in Rayford, I don't know if you saw it, was much different than the service that was in Minneapolis, and what I expect the service to be in Houston, because this was his actual family members who were really running this particular service. Were you able to see that yesterday, and what did you think about it?
I saw snippets of it, Ed. I didn't watch the entire service, but what I saw, it was indicative of services in rural communities, in the African American community in the state of North Carolina and all over the South. Mm-hmm. These services are much different than services that you find in major inner cities, in integrated services where the congregation is more integrated. And these people in these type services, they are much, much more emotional than the typical service. And if you're not accustomed to or acquainted with these type of services, you feel uncomfortable. You can be made to feel uncomfortable being a part of that. And some of it doesn't make sense to you. Why are they doing this in this manner when they should be here to support George Floyd? You know, and it seems like the pastor is trying to recruit other people to his church, or show other pastors how wonderful and great he is in the pulpit. And that's not what it was really intended to be about. This is what you would see when Joe Jones is buried next week and was just a carpenter at some plant down the street. This is just the way Black churches perform, especially in rural areas that have older congregation. They are not very high up on the economic or educational standards and that sort of thing. And it is reflected in the type of services that they have.
And I brought that up because out of the corner of my eye, the television is on, and they're playing services actually on BBC, and they're showing it there. So I'm presuming they're probably trying to figure out all the stuff. I do know that the minister providing over the service yesterday did take the time to explain what a praise break was and what they were doing when the band started playing music and that kind of thing in the middle of the service. To me, it's typical, like you said, of all the services that I grew up going to at McLean's Chapel Church, which is a sister church to the Cape Fear Conference Church where they had the funeral. Let's move on. I want to talk about one of the issues that I think initially probably didn't get talked about a lot, but in the last few days it has, which is they keep talking about defunding the police. And I put that in quotes, in my air quotes, because I think they probably could come up with a better term for what they're talking about. Whenever I talk to folks, even Kerwin Pittman I talked to earlier, when he talks about defunding the police, they're talking about taking some of those funds that have been used for policing to use for community services or to bring social workers into the police department and things like that. Because one of the things that we know for sure is that a police officer with someone with mental health is not necessarily the right person to have there. A man with a gun who doesn't know how to deal with people with mental health issues. And then you end up, killing some person who is only a threat really to themselves. And certainly not to the police officer who's heavily armed. Have you started to look at this defunding talk that people are talking about, and what do you make of it? And how would you describe it? Is there a better way to term this instead of defunding the police?
Yes, I have looked at it, Ed, because of the myriad of things that I've done in my working life. One was that I was the assistant business officer for the North Carolina School of the Arts in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, which is a part of the UNC system. That we have 5 historically Black colleges or universities involved in that. And because the budget for the North Carolina School of the Arts was so small, we got thrown into the PAC that governs all of the HBCUs. And I got to know all of the business officers within the HBCUs. And the common theme always was, well, here we go again. They're going to make us save money and turn money back in. They never put that on the backs of the traditional institutions, UNC and state and the rest of them. So they are making us do this. The point I'm trying to make here is this. Once the budget is attached and attacked, that changes the behavior of the institution. If, in fact, that you can defund or reallocate funding for police departments and change and channel some of those funds that are in question to some other activity, I think you can start controlling their behavior. There are 2 things that cause the police department to be out of control sometimes and to be problematic to the very people that are supposed to be protected and defended. That is the contract that they sign with the unions and the protection they have by the unions and their budget, which keeps going up. Towns like LA, Los Angeles, 54% of their budget goes to police. 54% of all of the other things that are needed, 54%. 0.8% goes to libraries. That tells you, you look at somebody's budget and it tells you what their value system is like. You can't continue to do that, spend that kind of money on police. And this last thing I'll make a note of is back in the 70s when Jimmy Carter introduced zero-based budgeting. It was based on the fact that we'll take a look at not what you spent last year, but you have to re-justify what you need each and every year. Mm-hmm. And that presented problems because as budgets go right now, when you're going through the expansion and continuation budget, it's all based on what you spent last year. I think that needs to be done, a little zero-based budgeting where we're not going to base this on how much you spent on batons and bayonets and bang, bang, rubber bullets last year. You have to justify next year what you need those things for. Sure. And if you can't justify it, you don't get the funding. And if you don't get the funding for it, then of course that changes your behavior.
Yeah.
I think that is a really good avenue, a good approach in getting back the streets from the police department. I know that doesn't sound right, but we're talking about getting the streets back from the police department, not from vis-a-vis the criminals. And I'm going to give it to them. Getting back the streets from the police department that should be controlled by our elected officials.
Yeah, I hear you. Absolutely. I want to remind the folks you're watching The Deal with Ed Clark and, of course, our resident political science expert, Val Atkinson, who's always in here to help us figure out how the world works. And then earlier we had Kerwin Pittman, who's an activist here in Raleigh, who's been leading the protests here in Raleigh. And he was able to have a meeting with the governor earlier this week with a list of I think positive demands. And then also today he's meeting with officials from the Raleigh City Council and the mayor to talk about what could be done to help improve police relations here in Raleigh, where I am. And I know we have viewers and listeners from all over the place. The issues in Raleigh aren't necessarily unique. I think, Val, you really encapsulated that these budgets, you know, you talked about LA, you talked about the North Carolina college system, all that, but budgets are really lopsided, though, when you take a look at them, particularly in policing. And one of the other issues that you did bring up in there was this whole issue of unions and how unions play into it. I'm actually working on my piece for today about what the police unions really are. They don't really look like the unions that we know about. So I want to kind of segue into that subject a little bit. One of the things that we found out is that in Minneapolis, the leader of the police union, who is a really big Trump fan, seems to have a lot of sway. He can almost force them to rehire those officers, say if they're not convicted, to be back on the force. What do you make of the growth of these police unions? And I even hate to call them unions because they're not unions in the classical sense, other than the fact that they negotiate wages and benefits, but they're also able to negotiate things like hiring and firing practices and release of video practices and things like that. What are your thoughts on those unions in quotes?
Well, one of the first things needs to be broken apart and looked at, Ed, is the relationship between elected officials and unions. Elected officials should not be able to take campaign contributions from unions, the very people that they are set aside to manage and control. But this is what happens. These folks who are elected officials are taking campaign contributions, and therefore they expect campaign contributions from the unions. The unions take these, they get their funds from dues and other sources from the police officers. So it's a roundabout kind of process of you scratch my back, I scratch yours. And that needs to be broken. The loser in this is the American public and those people who are brutalized by the police and then have no recourse or no redress for their problems. So the relationship between elected officials and unions needs to be examined. I like to call it refunding instead of defunding. Refunding the police, allocating resources in a different manner to different things. That way we get control back of our police department. I'll say this one last thing, Ed. It reminded me of the movie. You know, I'm a big fan of Westerns. And there's a Western out there directed by Ed Harris, and it's called Opelousas. And some people saw that movie, some didn't. But it's about these two guys going around towns and being hired by the town people when there is lawlessness in that town to sort of clean it up, whatever. And they become the marshal, the city marshal for a time. Well, these guys were going in someplace after things were cleaned up, they didn't want to go. They became the law. They became the lawless that people were trying to get rid of when they called them in. Now they're the people. Now who do you call in now to get rid of these guys? Some of these police forces, some of the people on some of these police forces are acting as if they are the sheriffs coming in to the new Opelousas. They control things. And they do things, and the people that they're supposed to be protecting should be afraid of them. If not, we're going to show you why you should be. And people who are supposed to be their boss are now kowtowing and bowing down to them, because if you don't support me and the flag and the country, and we're going to wrap all that in one, then you're not a good American, and it's gotten out of hand.
Yeah. If you're joining us in the middle of this conversation, that's Val Atkinson, former professor of political science at North Carolina Central University. Also, the list of things he's done is too long, so I won't even get into all of that. But as you hear him speak, just know that he's probably done something in that field. He has a very extensive background. That's why we have him on here every Sunday to kind of put things in perspective. Val, one of the things that I've been seeing is this proliferation of videos that show up online of some horrible incident with the police, and then the police may or may not be held accountable. And one thing I saw was in Buffalo, 75-year-old man, two police officers approach. They push him down. He bangs his head. Blood is pouring out. You see it on camera. And they walk away. And not only do they walk away, they seem not to really care at all. And then they are charged with a second-degree felony assault. And then all the police officers that were in that unit, 57 of them, resigned from that unit. Apparently, it's a volunteer position that's separate from their regular police position. But the 57 resigned from their position. What does that tell you about that particular Buffalo police force that they seem to value the blue code over the health and safety of this 75-year-old man who obviously was not a threat and was defenseless? And I'm pretty sure you've seen the video by now as well.
Absolutely. Well, again, it reminds me of the town marshal in Opelousas. These guys see themselves as the law. Whatever they say goes. Whatever they want happens. And when I first saw the video, Ed, that you that you alluded to, I thought of myself. I mean, I am of that age group, and I have physical conditions that my balance is not perfect anymore. And a hearty push would throw me off balance. And next thing you know, I'm bumping my head against the pavement. And this guy's got blood gushing out of his ears. You're thinking right away, brain damage or something of that nature. And people walk by, the police officers continue to walk by. And the mayor tried to clean it up and explain, the police officer, supervisor tried to explain that the police had been trained to not stop what their mission is, to help either one of their own or someone else that has been injured. And that's why they embed medical personnel within each unit as medics, as they did on the battlefield. The invasion of Normandy, I think about in World War II, D-Day, somebody gets hit, you yell, medic, medic, and he comes over and you keep doing your job. That's why they tried to explain it away that way. But this was a different circumstance. Here's a guy bleeding. There's one officer that stopped and was going to try to give aid. He was pulled away by another officer saying, no, you can't do that. Just let him later. Somebody else will come get him later. You know, this is about the culture of law enforcement in America. These guys were trained to do that. I think if that circumstance had happened before either of those guys became law enforcement officials, I think they would have acted or reacted differently. Because that's not in their DNA to walk away from a 75-year-old man laying on the concrete, bleeding, blood gushing out of his ears because he hit his head, the back of his head on concrete. You know, we're not trained that way as human beings. So it's the training, it's the culture of law enforcement itself that really needs to be turned inside out and looked at again, because the initial purpose of policing, law enforcement in the beginning, didn't have this in mind. It had in mind protecting settlers and other people from Native Americans, slave revolts, and those sorts of things. That was the primary purpose of policing. And right now, we don't know what the primary purpose of policing is anymore, because we don't have slaves and we don't have Native Americans at the ready trying to take their country back.
Well, at least not officially, right? We don't have slaves. I guess I've been thinking a lot about this paramilitarization or militarization of the police. You know, you see them come in with these armored vehicles. It's reminiscent of being in Fallujah or somewhere, or you see them dressed in this tactical gear, even when they're going to make raids on houses for people that have basically, felony drug charges and things like that. Or all you got to do is look at a show like Live PD or back in the day, Cops. And you see the steady evolution of policing into this sort of, again, like I said, paramilitary force. And a lot of that had to do with money being handed out in the form of grants or whatever, and then police being able to do whatever they want with it. Do you see any urge at all on people in Congress to maybe pull some of that funding back and not to allow that to continue, this unlimited funding for things like, this paramilitary equipment?
It's got to be done through, first of all, legislation that talks about the purpose, the functionality of these law enforcement entities. In other words, if you change the purpose, if you change the goal, the mission of some of these units, then obviously they don't qualify or need some of the equipment and some of the financial assistance that they're getting now today. So that's where you change it. In other words, if you're going to talk about funding for gas masks and for high explosive grenade launchers or whatever, well, you take them out of the business of doing that. If their need of that comes up, the National Guard has to step in. So local police force doesn't need that anymore. So that goes off the budget. All of these things about serving as crosswalk guards and people in high schools and that sort of thing. If kick them out, if you don't need that, then you'll find that you need less law enforcement personnel. Mm-hmm. So if your base salary budget was $600 million of that $8 billion that you're using, then that can be cut, that can be reduced. You can't have a reduction of 15 to 20% of your workforce and say your salary or your funding needs to remain the same. It can't be. So I think the re-examination, the evaluation of what the mission is, or what you want it to be as an elected official of these law enforcement agencies, will be the door opening salvo to change in a fundamental way what they do and how they do it.
Yeah. Well, we're a full 3/4 of the way through the program. The time flies, and we haven't even gotten to, I think, one of the main issues that I think has again galvanized the protests and whatever is the whole notion of Black Lives Matter. And obviously there's an organization now called Black Lives Matter that sprung out of, the thing with Michael Brown and Eric Garner and now you have Breonna Taylor and of course George Floyd and a number of other people who have been killed by the police, who are African American, who definitely are treated different. You can see it in the traffic stop information. I saw the city of Chapel Hill had done some extensive research, and they took a look into themselves, and they decided that it was clear that they were stopping African Americans at a much more significant rate. And they reevaluated how they were going to go about doing that. That's one police department, though, in one town in North Carolina. In a lot of places, I found out they don't even have information on the difference between how African Americans are stopped and or ticketed or whatever. But there are some national studies that say that even when African Americans are stopped, they tend to have less infractions than the white people who are stopped. But they tend to be treated differently and also penalized at a higher rate. So it comes back to the whole issue of race. Val, one of the things that I do know is, because I've been in states like Montana and Idaho and North Dakota, there are not a lot of Black people. And so when you try to get white people involved or to take accountability for these issues, a lot of white people, the first thing they say is, my grandparents didn't own slaves. Can you talk to me, from the historical perspective here about, the notion of whiteness for one and white privilege, and then two, how you bring it up to current day and and we've seen a lot of white people out there protesting. Let's not make any, mistake about that, but it's not everybody. So talk to me historically about how white people have viewed themselves and what their relationship is to working in causes related to Black folks in America.
Most of the interviews that I've seen on television recently about this whole subject of racism in America, it seems to get down to the point that the white person who would, whether it be an elected official or a celebrity, whomever, ends up asking the question, well, what can I do? Is there something I can do to make things better? Because it appears that everybody's looking for that silver bullet. One thing you can tell them, okay, always do this and never do that. And they walk away thinking, well, if I do that and never do this, then I'm not a racist. Well, it's a little bit more to it than that. And the problem is that white people in general, Ed, have never been exposed to race, racism, the identification of it. And that's mainly because they've never been exposed to the true history, their history of white people in America, white people in the world. They've never been exposed to, they've run away from it. And it is almost unfathomable. I have on our show, Connections, we always have a piece in there that we deal with in terms of reviewing books. And I have a book that I think I've recommended from time to time that I'd like to mention just one time. I saw the lady, Robin DiAngelo, interviewed this morning on one of the talk shows. Her book is called White Fragility. And it is the most comprehensive book that I think for white people who've never been exposed to what real life is about outside of their little cocoon. As a white person lived in, you don't have to live in a gated community, but you live in a segregated community, and your kids go to a segregated school, and your social events are segregated, your backyard barbecues are segregated. Everything is excluded from the world of color. And therefore, you know nothing about what's going on in that world. And you think that, well, give me one or two things I can do, and everything's going to be fine. And the only way we can escape that, Ed, or where we need to start is with education. These folks are going to have to start reading. They're going to have to expose themselves to the kinds of things that they've been running from all their lives. They're going to have to look at the other side of the ledger for a change. Maybe even enroll in some classes that are put on by Ed Clark and Val Atkinson to talk about those kinds of things. But seriously speaking, they're going to have to become educated as to what's really going on with race in America. What's the true nature of your origins and your relationship with Native Americans, with Africans, with Hispanics? How did you get all of that Western and Midwestern land out there? Did Mexico give it to you, or did you take it? We're going to have to start looking at truth in the eye. And we're going to have to start looking at things. When Ira Katz, an author, he's got a book called When Affirmative Action Was White. You're going to have to look at that. When guys came back from the war and had GI Bills and bought houses and funded themselves through a higher education and got a BA degree. That was for white people only. They fought in foxholes right beside a black guy, or the Red Tails and the Tuskegee Airmen, chauffeuring these planes around. They didn't qualify for what we call GI Bill at that time. Most white people have no idea about these things. They're too busy trying to make sure they have the opportunity to walk around with their white swagger and brag to the international crowd that they are Americans and brag to the national crowd that they are white.
Well, Val, there's one guy, and I've been reluctant to bring him up. You notice that we're only got about 9 minutes left, and we haven't even talked about him. But he lives at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, and he did some really heinous things this week. And two things that really bothered me the most is when him clearing the way to make way for a photo op when he went across the street to St. John's Church to hold up a Bible upside down. And two, when he announced the unemployment numbers and said that George Floyd was looking down and he was probably happy at the moment looking down, seeing that the unemployment numbers were at 13% when actually the numbers for black folks went up, but he didn't want to talk about that. He again, belittle Michelle Sender, the reporter that he seems to have an ongoing battle with. I like I said, I'm reluctant to talk about the president because I don't know if he's just even getting rid of him is probably part of the solution, but it's not the entire solution. Talk to me about the performance of the president through COVID, now through the George Floyd thing, and the protest. And Is he redeemable at all? Or is he just incorrigible, and we might as well just give up on that?
Incorrigible. He doesn't have it in his makeup to be presidential. He doesn't want to, and even if he wanted to, he doesn't have that. His personality doesn't reach that far to allow him to behave in a presidential manner. So he puts on, in some cases, an act as if his job is to change the way presidents operate, and all presidents should have been acting like he acts all the time. He is a product of a group of Republicans who have finally faced the fact that they cannot win everyday elections that are fair, and that they need to do something that's not fair in order to get their ideology imposed on the rest of society. So therefore, what they're going to do is to support Donald Trump, whether he's right, wrong, or indifferent, regardless of how it impacts the country. He's their man. He's the guy. These are the people that are giving Donald Trump cover to do all of the negative things to this country that he is doing. And I want people that are listening to us, Ed, to know that Donald Trump is the symptom. Barack Obama said this. The United States senators are the cause of all of these things. Donald Trump is a symptom. So if you're going to the polls to vote on November the 3rd or earlier, remember, if you have an opportunity to vote for a U.S. senator, keep that in mind, who's really allowing Donald Trump to be who he is. It's these Republican U.S. senators.
I'm glad you bring that up, because I know we're working on something for next weekend on connections. Tell us about what we have in store related to the U.S. Senate race here in North Carolina.
Cal Cunningham, who is the Democratic nominee for the position of U.S. Senator from North Carolina, is going to be our guest. We are proud to have him on, and he'll be running against the incumbent, which is Thom Tillis. And this is going to be an interesting race. The Democrats need to flip 4 seats. There are 22 Republicans running for re-election across the country. And the Democrats need to hold on to those seats they have, plus flip 4 of those seats, and the Democrats take over the Senate. And we don't worry about even if Donald Trump gets re-elected, he is going to be powerless. So the senatorial races are, in fact, maybe even more important than the presidential race, because the senators are the ones that's keeping Donald Trump in power and allowing him to perform as he is. So you need to know if, in fact, your senator, your state, has one of these senators running for re-election, and then act accordingly.
Yeah, I think it's important that we hear from Cal Cunningham. You know, I think anybody who's running for office is finding it hard to find some TV time or whatever, short of doing commercials. And you need to hear from candidates in long form about what they plan on doing or whatever. So what we plan to do is to make that interview available later on in the deal. So we'll have a segment of the deal that has portions of that interview in there. You can also hear the interview at 8:00 on next Sunday on Connections on Foxy 107, 104. That'll be live at the time, but then we'll replay portions of it during the 1:00, the deal next Sunday. So I think it's important that we start thinking about all these other races that have an impact, that the president alone, yes, he can cause a lot of mischief and trouble, but at the same time, we have to figure out a way. How do we then make the Senate run efficiently? Moscow Mitch has not allowed much to come through the Senate. We got a few minutes left, Val. One thing that did come through the Senate this week is Lindsey Graham started hearings on the 2016 investigation launch of Donald Trump associates related to Russia. And they called up Rod Rosenstein last Thursday. What is that all about? Why are we still dealing with that? What does AG Barr have up his sleeve, and consequently consequently Lindsey Graham, because they could have been filed charges against people if there was anything that was really there. I mean, they've run the whole show for the last several years. So what is this about?
It's called distractions. It's one of the biggest items in Donald Trump's playbook. When things go bad, you look to change the narrative, distract people from what's going on. What they hope happens through this investigation, Ed, is that they can come up with stories that the media will say, oh, Mr. Jones, I wasn't aware of this. Can you tell us more about that? Now the whole media jumps on that, and it becomes more questions. It could have even been questions for Hillary Clinton that somebody didn't ask before. It could be questions for anybody. They want to change the narrative and change the subject so that when we're going into November, it's not about Donald Trump and the things he did or didn't do. It's about the lies, the deep state stuff that Comey was involved in, and Hillary and all of these other people that were trying to confuse the American electorate. And that should be, and we're not going to allow that. Give us 4 more years. And people forget about everything that Trump's, it's just distractions. And they're looking for anything that might stick against the wall.
Well, Val, we covered a lot of ground today. We've gone all the way from Minneapolis to Raleigh to everywhere, and obviously protests are going on around the world again. The BBC is playing out of my right eye here in there are protests going on in London and Paris again today. Before the German soccer league games today, they all took a knee. And obviously, George Floyd's death has resonated, I think, because it was so clearly on video. You could not ignore that he was murdered in real time, and a 17-year-old girl had to stand there and film it. Otherwise, nobody would have known about it. He just would have been another guy who was resisting arrest, right? And we know, in fact, that was not the case because she was brave enough to stand there and take that video. I think I would say for anybody, if you see anything, God, thank God that, people do take the time to take these videos. I'm getting sick of seeing the videos, though. I'd like to come to a point one day where we don't see those videos, but that comes with reforming policing and police departments. And we've talked about how to get towards police reform. I think it's going to take maybe even busting up some of these police unions. Maybe cities get rid of their police department altogether and reconstitute something else like public safety, where you call out a social worker and a medic before you call out the police, especially when somebody has a mental health issue. I mean, it's a lot of stuff that needs to be on the table. In addition to that, Val Atkinson is right. White people do have to be accountable for not knowing the real history of America, that the sanitized version of history that George Washington chopped down a cherry tree and he was a great president and everything was good. And then Lincoln came along, then, some stuff happened. And then now we're here where we are, and everybody needs a gun because of the Second Amendment. That's the extent of American history for a lot of people. And it's not real. It's not true. It doesn't do anything for us. Val is, fond of saying that we're only 4% of the world's population, but we act like we own the whole world. And that's in fact the case. Val Atkins, is there anything else you need to tell us today before we get out of here?
Yeah, well, as a part of our commitment to the education of Americans, Fox 107, 104, and Radio 1 has joined hands with the Durham Alumni Chapter of Kappa Alpha Psi Fraternity Incorporated, and we have a program called V, Voter Education and Participation. And we encourage people to get in contact with their voting precincts, their voting apparatuses at the state and county level to ensure that you're still registered to vote. And do that right through November the 3rd, because people have been accidentally and intentionally taking off voting rolls that should not be taken off. So please make sure that's the case and get your plan together, your logistical plan together to get yourself and your friends to the poll on the 3rd and leave no one behind Don't take your buddy's word when he says he's going to vote. Make sure he does in any way that's necessary that you have to do. So voter education and participation is the key word, and we want to make sure that that happens. I'd like to leave a telephone number, Ed, for people who need to call in to leave suggestions and ask questions about our show, Connections. The number is 919-656-5240 because our show is taped now. And if you want to leave a message for us, a comment, or ask a question to be read over the air, you can do so by leaving a voicemail at that number or leaving a text message at that number. And we'll handle your comment or question that way.
All right. Well, thanks again, Val. I want to remind the folks you've been watching and listening to The Deal with Ed Clark. We had Kerwin Pittman. He's the leader of, I won't say the leader, he's one of the many leaders of the protest movement here in Raleigh. But he had a audience with the mayor today, and I thought that took precedence. We were scheduled to be on with Val live, and we were going to open up the phone and take calls or whatever. We're going to reschedule that with Kerwin so he can take calls from folks and people can respond to what's been going on here in Raleigh, but also we can talk about the movement in general. Of course, you know, we appreciate you taking the time to come in here. You could be doing something else on a Sunday afternoon. You can always go back and look at this. If you can't look at it live, you can always also refer other people to it. I think we have good information. We always have good guests. So that's one thing that I make a point of doing, is going out and trying to get people to talk about what their expertise is. And we had Kerwin Pittman on to talk about that today. And of course, Val Atkinson is always on. We're going to be back next Sunday at 1 o'clock. At 8 o'clock next Sunday, join me and Val for Connections on Foxy 107, 104. Like Val said, we'll have Cal Cunningham in, and then we'll replay parts of that Cal Cunningham interview at 1 o'clock on The Deal. So in the meantime, go out and do something good for somebody this week. Things are going to get better. Trust me. We are in a very low point right now, but it won't always be like that. But do your part to make it better. And we'll see you next Sunday on The Deal. Thanks. Bye.